Some secrets are not meant to be read. They are meant to be reflected. And the truest reflection is always the fractured self. Dr. Alastair Finch was a man who specialized in the peripheral, the discarded footnotes of human history. For 30 years, he had served as the quiet, meticulous curator of the Miskatonic University's special collections, a job that suited his fastidious nature and his deep-seated distrust of the visible world. He sought the truth in the shadows, believing that what was actively suppressed was always more potent than what was celebrated. His focus narrowed to an obsession with one item, known only in hushed academic circles as the speculum aetatis, the mirror of the ages. The records were sparse, conflicting, and ended abruptly in the 17th century, with a decree from the Holy Office classifying it as an object of profound and immediate peril. It was said not to reflect light, but to absorb and re-emit the very structure of perception. Finch found it in a dusty, unmarked crate in the sub-basement of the library, not catalogued, merely filed away, wrapped in layers of heavy, lead-lined canvas. When he finally peeled away the last layer in the sterile, air-locked environment of his preparation lab, he was greeted not by a mirror, but by a dense, palm-sized orb of polished obsidian. It was perfectly smooth, utterly black, and unnervingly cold to the touch. It seemed to drink the powerful overhead lights, yielding no reflection, only a dizzying void. It was not a mirror in the traditional sense. It was the absolute absence of one. Finch, a man of scientific rationalism, noted the anomalous properties, its impossible specific gravity, the minor radiation signature, the way it made the fine hairs on his arm stand up, and dismissed the historical warnings as superstitious hysteria. He labeled it the Finch obsidian for the catalog and placed it under a reinforced glass dome in his private, climate-controlled study. The troubles began immediately. Subtle intrusions into the rigid order of his world. He started finding objects slightly misplaced. His favorite antique watch, always on the nightstand, would appear on the opposite dresser. The spine of a textbook he had just been reading would be reversed on the shelf. These were not mistakes of memory. They were deliberate. He began to feel intensely observed. This was a novel and deeply unpleasant sensation for a man whose life was defined by solitude. The feeling was always strongest when his back was to the obsidian orb. When he turned suddenly, catching the reflection in the polished wood of his desk, he saw only the distorted shadow of his own form, but lingering at the edge of his peripheral vision was a flicker, a movement that seemed to originate within the black glass itself. He started keeping a meticulous log, an attempt to quantify the irrational. His entries, initially precise and clinical, began to slip into subjective, emotional language. Entry 14. The orb is not merely absorbing light. It is absorbing presence. When I look into it, I no longer see nothing. I see a profound, demanding expectation. Entry 21. The anxiety is unbearable. I am no longer certain if the reflection in the hallway mirror is me, or merely a successful imitation of my movements. I can't shake the feeling that my imitation is ahead of me by half a second. The true horror, however, manifested in the photographs. Finch used his camera to record the orb's interaction with light. When the film was developed, the obsidian was exactly as he had seen it, a void. But in one photo, taken from a strange, low angle, the background was warped. The rows of books, the sturdy desk, the familiar furniture, they were all slightly skewed, as if viewed through heavy, distorting glass. And on the surface of the orb itself, there was a single, tiny, luminous point, like a distant star captured in a well of ink. Finch zoomed in on the point. It wasn't a star. It was a single, pale, vertical slit. An eye. The slit in the obsidian was Finch's undoing. The meticulous curator transformed into a hunted animal. He covered the orb with a heavy blackout cloth, but the relief was minimal. The presence was still there, palpable, no longer seen but felt, pressing against the fragile walls of his perception. He began to fear mirrors, then glass, then any polished surface. The smooth tile floor of his kitchen became a source of intense anxiety. He avoided windows, preferring the absolute darkness of his covered study. He knew, instinctively, that the creature, the entity that lived within the obsidian, communicated through reflection. It needed a surface to bridge the gap, to show the viewer what was true and what was monstrously possible. His paranoia crystallized around a new and terrifying idea. The entity was not trapped inside the orb. It was always outside. The orb merely served as its eye, its point of observation. One afternoon, standing in the library stacks, Finch reached for a specific, obscure text. As he did so, he saw his own face reflected briefly in the varnished wood of the shelf opposite. The reflection was simultaneous, perfect, except that the reflected Finch did not blink. He stared with a profound, hungry intensity. Finch blinked deliberately, a slow, sustained closure of the lids. The reflection did not follow. When Finch opened his eyes, the reflection in the wood was gone. But the book he had reached for was now one shelf lower than he remembered, and its spine was facing backward. The entity was not a ghost or a simple demon. It was an entity of anti-causality. It operated in the gaps of attention, the moments when consciousness was momentarily suspended, using those slivers of time to exert its influence. It wasn't just observing him, it was learning his habits, his preferences, his very physical structure. He started taking preventative measures that bordered on madness. He began covering all reflective surfaces in his home: mirrors, television screens, even the polished chrome of the kettle. He ate in the dark, using heavy ceramic dishes that absorbed all light. His world became dull, matte, and safe, but the entity was adapting. One night, exhausted and trembling, Finch looked down at the mug of cold tea he was clutching. The liquid was dark, opaque, and still. And in the still surface of the tea, he saw it. It wasn't his face. It was a face that should have been his. A distorted copy, skin stretched too thin over the bone. The mouth widened into a cavernous, lipless shape. And the eyes, they were entirely black, featureless spheres, twin shards of obsidian. The reflection smiled. It was a slow, sickening movement that carried the weight of ancient, malicious knowledge. And then, the reflection raised a hand, its hand, and traced a line from its jaw to its temple. Finch felt a sharp, agonizing pressure at his own temple. He dropped the mug. The tea splashed, the reflection shattered, and the pain instantly subsided. He spent the rest of the night clawing at the wall of his study, trying to gouge out the varnish and expose the rough, non-reflective plaster beneath, desperately trying to eliminate every possible surface the thing could use. Finch knew he was losing. The entity had successfully breached his defenses, moving from the physical world, misplacing objects, to the psychological, the non-blinking reflection, and finally to the organic, the painful pressure. His mind was fracturing under the strain of perpetual vigilance. He needed an exit. He returned to the orb, now wrapped tightly in the blackout cloth. He sat before it, lamp on his desk, his eyes deliberately averted from the table's glossy surface. He began to catalog his knowledge of the entity, speaking into a small, antique dictaphone, hoping that the act of verbalizing the truth would solidify it, keep it from dissolving into psychosis. "The entity is not restricted to the orb," he whispered into the microphone. "The orb is merely a focus, a tuning fork. It is a portal for observation, a device that allows a non-Euclidean consciousness to intersect with our three-dimensional space via light reflection. It uses the very act of seeing to transmit its influence." He played back a portion of the recording. His voice sounded thin, reedy, utterly terrified. But beneath his own words, a faint, scraping sound was audible. A noise like dry fingernails dragging across stone. He swallowed hard. "It communicates knowledge," he continued, voice steadier now. "The reflections are not hallucinations. They are glimpses of a different truth. The face I saw in the tea was not a monster. It was me, but evolved into a form suitable for its dimension. It shows me the self I must become to understand its knowledge." The knowledge, the forbidden truth, was the ultimate bait. He began to pore over the original Latin texts related to the speculum aetatis. He found a recurring marginalia, a warning scribbled by a terrified scholar centuries ago. "Non respicias oculum quite non habet." Do not look into the eye that does not possess you. Finch realized the final, most chilling implication. The entity needed a reflection to observe, but it needed a human mind to act. It was using the reflections to slowly, meticulously restructure his mind, remap his neural pathways, and turn him into a suitable vessel. It wanted not only to look out, but to step out. He found the solution in the scholar's final, almost illegible scrawl. "Frange speculum, frange oculum." Break the mirror, break the eye. But the obsidian orb was impossibly hard, impervious to physical force. Finch had tried to scratch it, to chip it, to melt it. It had resisted every effort. He looked at his hands, his dry, trembling, overworked hands. He was the tool of the entity, the unwilling medium. The only way to break the eye was to break the one thing the entity relied on most, his own reflection. Finch knew what he had to do. The ritual was precise, insane, and absolutely necessary. He carefully removed the blackout cloth from the obsidian orb. He placed it in the exact center of his study, positioning a single, powerful desk lamp above it. He turned off all other lights, plunging the room into shadow save for the harsh, direct beam. The obsidian surface was magnificent in the light, a perfect, glossy blackness that offered nothing back. Yet, as he watched, the surface seemed to shimmer, drawing the light down into itself, creating a palpable, vertical vortex of nothingness. He moved to the furthest wall, where a full-length, antique cheval mirror stood, its ornate wood frame a vestige of the home's original architecture. He had covered it with thick paper, but now he ripped the paper away. He stood facing the glass, his reflection gaunt, hollow-eyed, and terrified. The entity, alerted by the sudden, massive surface, was focusing its energy. Finch walked slowly toward the mirror, never taking his eyes off his own image. The entity had relied entirely on the purity of the reflection to operate. By deliberately breaking the reflection, not the glass, but the human image itself, by making his face an unrecognizable, bleeding ruin, Finch had caused an irrecoverable cognitive dissonance. The orb, the reflection, was becoming the vessel. It was preparing to cross. But Finch had an advantage. The entity was projecting the truth of the vessel it wanted. He waited until the reflected face was almost completely monstrous, a hideous, inhuman iteration of himself. He saw the pale, vertical slit of the eye, now fully formed in the center of the black orb's surface behind the reflection. The entity was watching, its awareness fully engaged, ready to make the final leap into the prepared biological shell. The reflection in the mirror smiled again, that slow, wet, ancient smile, and extended a hand, a skeletal, elongated claw, reaching for the barrier between the worlds. Finch stopped inches from the mirror, his breath catching in his throat. He did not look at the monster in the glass. He focused on the reflection of the orb behind it. The entity's true form was not in the mirror, but in the obsidian. The mirror was merely the door. He raised his heavy iron paperweight, a dense, perfectly polished sphere of brass. It was a beautiful object, and in its convex surface, he saw a tiny, precise reflection of his entire environment. The darkened room, his terrified face, the looming monster in the cheval mirror, and the obsidian orb itself, with the pale slit of the eye clearly visible. He brought the brass sphere down, not onto the mirror, but onto his own face. The impact was immediate, a shocking, skull-jarring blow to the bridge of his nose. Pain exploded in his head, a blinding, white-hot agony. Blood instantly streamed from his nose and eyes, obscuring his vision, pouring over his hands. The sound of the impact, the cracking of cartilage and bone, was immediately echoed by an impossibly loud, shattering sound that did not come from the mirror. Finch staggered back, blind, his face a ruin of blood and pain. He fell to his knees, his hands pressed to his ruined features. When the dizzying wave of pain subsided, he risked opening one weeping eye. The cheval mirror was completely intact. His blurred reflection looked back at him, now terrified, shattered, and bleeding, but human. He looked back at the desk. The obsidian orb, the speculum aetatis, was gone. In its place was a pile of fine, crystalline dust, shimmering faintly in the lamplight. It was the only debris, the only sign of the relic. The entity had relied entirely on the purity of the reflection to operate. By deliberately breaking the reflection, not the glass, but the human image itself, by making his face an unrecognizable, bleeding ruin, Finch had caused an irrecoverable cognitive dissonance. The orb, unable to project its perfectly formed vessel onto the now fractured image, had been overwhelmed by the conflicting data, and the impossible material had simply destabilized and dissolved. Finch had destroyed the eye by destroying his own ability to be seen as whole. He sat on the floor, the metallic tang of blood filling his mouth, a man who had chosen disfigurement over transformation. He was safe, for the moment. The knowledge was contained. He reached for the dictaphone. His hand found the small metal object, and he clicked the record button. He opened his mouth to narrate the final entry, his triumph. But when he spoke, the sound that emerged was not his voice. It was a deep, clicking, wet sound, the sound of a jaw that had been stretched too wide. And on the dictaphone's tiny metallic casing, he saw the blurry reflection of a single, black, featureless eye. The entity was not gone. It was just looking through a smaller, more intimate mirror. It was now listening.